Thank you very much. So I'm going to start by just telling you a little bit about how we came to make these recommendations to begin with, which was to talk to a number of, we call DMA stakeholders, business users, gatekeepers, regulators, and civil society organizations, and engage in a fairly lengthy conversation with each one. And I'm perfectly happy to talk to more if any of you would like to be subjected to a one-hour interview to gather more data, because it really allowed us to see a lot of what goes on inside the practice of DMA compliance before we get to an examination of formal powers. We asked the stakeholders also what their views were on what the formal powers were, but the real value of that, the engagement from our side, was really a better understanding of the informal interactions that obtain between the Commission and the various stakeholders and among the various stakeholders with each other. So what I'm going to do in the next few slides is just give you a fairly high-level summary of the conclusions and recommendations that we've made that draw largely on these interviews, which of course are not comprehensive. There are many more stakeholders than the 21 we've talked to, but I think they gave us a fairly interesting inside picture and a very detailed analysis from their perspective of what they thought was right and what was wrong. So the first thing that came out of most of the conversations was that whilst the bilateral conversations that stakeholders had with the Commission were very helpful, the most helpful value came from trilateral conversations where gatekeepers, business users, and the Commission were in the same room trying to solve the same problem. And this is kind of aligned with a study by the Joint Research Center a few months ago where they suggested that the co-creation of compliant, effective solutions by a variety of stakeholders is a preferred mechanism for securing compliance because it also allows for innovation. By having more people contribute to how compliance should be designed, one can think more outside the box of the two parties in the conversation. We also recommend in the report the use of online tools to promote business user gatekeeper engagement. There are probably some technical issues that can be resolved fairly immediately between the two sides, and perhaps technology can be used to assist that. We got a sense that the compliance reports were very heavy and not perhaps particularly useful for many of the stakeholders because the gatekeepers kept adjusting their compliance after the delivery of the document, and a more living instrument type of compliance report might be more helpful to understand the state of process, in particular regarding certain obligations, but more generally in communicating to business users and consumers what their expectations are as compliance evolves. We also think that the compliance office role could be expanded by asking that the compliance officer offers an opinion on whether or not there is compliance. We then had some recommendations which are directly to the European Commission, and the first is to think about formulating a set of priorities. And the priorities are not, let's go for contestability and not fairness, but rather, let's have a set of principles that guide us to decide how we use our limited resources. What are the end goals that we are prioritizing and wanting to achieve, and then what are the mechanisms that we can use in-house to move towards those. The Commission should also be more willing to provide substantive guidance. This is something that came across from a variety of stakeholders, that the Commission never seems to want to commit as to where the compliance point is in a discussion, and perhaps a little bit more steering of the parties and a bit more of taking of a position by the Commission on this point might be helpful. Now, we're still in the early days of enforcement, as has been said before, but I think it is important that the Commission decides and explains what the difference is between a specification decision and when that process is started and when a non-compliance pathway is begun. So one way of thinking about it, as we suggest in the report, is that specification is when there's a lack of clarity between the parties as to what optimal compliance might mean, whereas a non-compliance decision is when there is an absolutely different view about what compliance means between the Commission and the gatekeeper. Now, if you look at the process that you can trace through the current compliance process, you may get the sense that that is what the Commission is doing, but explaining that to the public might be useful. I think in the long term it may also be useful to extend the specification powers to Article 5, and also in the report we suggest perhaps finding ways of encouraging specification requests by gatekeepers themselves. That may be something that the Commission can work harder at rather than the Commission deciding to issue specifications on its own. We then had to look a little bit at the institutional arrangements, and our first recommendation is perhaps a bit provocative, but to suggest that rather than having a DMA team composed of officials from different directorates general, that we can start thinking about a DMA team as an independent entity itself within the European Commission. That might give it a more unity of purpose and a more single message, rather than what the interviewees sometimes told us is different messaging depending on where the comment was coming, which DG the comment was coming from. Now, in terms of dividing tasks with national competent authorities, indeed, authorities, as has been said before, can engage in advocacy and can be a first point of contact. And in our first report on the DMA in 2021, we indeed recommended that because of the limited staffing, that there should be secondments made from national competition authorities to the European Commission, and it's good to see that that has been taken up somewhat. The other point we wanted to make was about safeguards that the DMA needs to have. And these are safeguards to protect both gatekeepers and business users. From the gatekeeper side, we think it's worth thinking about developing a function a bit like the hearing officer that we have in antitrust. Now, many people pushed back when we recommend that because they said, why do we need it? Well, the Commission began enforcing competition law without a hearing officer. But as soon as fundamental rights issue became relevant, then it was felt necessary to create the office of the hearing officer. Therefore, learning from history, it might be worthwhile anticipating the need to safeguard the rights of gatekeepers by creating a hearing officer. But also, I think it is important to pay attention to business users. Business users have been very active in communicating their views and their evidence to the European Commission, and there is a sense that this needs to be maintained. There is an informational asymmetry between the Commission and the regulated firms, and somehow business users can help bridge that by bringing in their own experience. And so some sort of guidelines to manage the expectations that business users may have can be useful. Under the DMA, there are no legal rights for business users, but there can be a mechanism now that the Commission has heard from so many stakeholders to provide some guidelines as to how to best provide information to the European Commission, and then some sort of indication as to what the process is once this information comes in, rather than this information just going into a black box where we don't know what's going to happen, provide some clarity. And this is important to continue the conversation that the Commission has with business users, which can be to the regulator's advantage in understanding better how markets are evolving. And finally, we had a few thoughts about strengthening regulatory cooperation. And this is both at national level, where there are multiple regulators in the digital space which should coordinate among each other. And we know that in some member states there are fora for coordination. We also think it's important that there should be good coordination between EU and national level when there is parallel application of very similar rules. But what I want to focus on for the purposes of today is EU-level cooperation. So we know there is a high-level group, and we know there is a Digital Markets Advisory Committee, but these committees score rather low on transparency and on stakeholder engagement. We don't really know what they're doing, and I think they could engage more stakeholders than they currently do. So I think these are important initiatives of cooperation, both at the EU level and at national level, which come with a very difficult premise, which is different regulatory entities, although looking at the same object, come at it from very different perspectives. And so it's not as if it would be a magic trick that by creating a single point where all regulators can network, we have solutions to problems overnight. The first problem to overcome, and we did this in a CERRE study a few years ago, is understanding the languages that each other speak. We both understand data subjects, but we understand data subjects in a different perspectives. Some see data as something of value, some see data as a fundamental right. So building a culture of conversation between a variety of digital regulators is not a simple solution. It's the beginning of a conversation which may lead to better enforcement. In the longer term, we see value in creating a European system of digital regulators, much like with the European Central Bank, where there is a central bank that manages systemic banks and then national authorities working very closely with the European Central Bank, supervising local entities. Some similar division of labor can probably be something which can be thought about also within the context of the DMA. This, of course, is a long-term perspective. I think for the short term, what we've recommended is a set of minor improvements. The general view of many of the conversations we've had is that the Commission is doing its best with its limited resources to achieve appropriate regulatory outcomes, but there's nothing that is good that cannot be made better, and we hope some of these solutions can achieve that. Thank you.